Early Polemical Writings is a volume in Kierkegaard's collected writings containing his early works published separately over several years. Much of the material in this volume had never before been translated into English. Kierkegaard's first article addresses the theme of the emancipation of women. A fellow student, Peter Lind, had previously written a short article, typical for the time, on the role of women in society, responding to suggestions that women should participate more in higher education and literary circles. Lind's article sarcastically praised women for skills such as sewing and other domestic abilities. At the age of 21, Kierkegaard picks up where Lind left off but writes with more wit. Despite this, his article, like Lind's, reflects a somewhat unkind and pessimistic attitude toward the academic potential of women. He observes that women keep abreast of events, and that even papers and journals considered insignificant by men do not escape their attention. In fashion magazines, they study the spirit of the age. He writes, "Just as of old ladies were acknowledged as umpires, so now shall dissertations, plays, philosophical works, be submitted to your judgment. From Eve's hand we shall receive the apple of knowledge, so elevate yourselves, then, above the earth. So fly, then, from this ungrateful earth, raise yourselves on the wings of philosophy, and look down with contempt on those whose cowardly, servile minds would, with the Jews of old, prefer to remain behind by the flesh-pots." Although the form of the article reflects the conventions of the period and Kierkegaard's youth, it demonstrates his early wit and emerging interest in pseudonymity. While it cannot be said that he had yet conceived his lifelong pseudonymous project, the pseudonym A would later appear in either or. The next piece is an essay, written for the Student Association and not intended for publication. It responds to a paper by Johannes Ostermann, who argued that the press was responsible for much political reform. Kierkegaard addresses Ostermann's claims directly, overturning them point by point rather than engaging with broader concerns about journalism, a topic he would explore in later years. He asserts that reform primarily came from Frederick VI rather than liberal newspapers. He concludes that liberal journalism in papers such as Jobenhavensposten and Fædrelandet has not been as active as one is perhaps inclined to believe. While he does not dispute that papers can rouse people, he denies that they have been effective instruments of political reform. He writes, "Although I heartily approve brisk action and also reflection, as that which collects and in the instant secures the often dissipated energies and thereby, like the significant silence before the battle, conditions new and vigorous activity, I must, however, just as heartily disapprove of a phenomenon that often assumes the shape of reflection, a certain morbid imagining that hinders both action and true reflection, and if it does allow true reflection to break through for once, and then, if there has been any movement at all, true reflection reveals the past period more as an approach to caricature than to the ideal, the morbid imagination promptly lets a person fall into the same old daydreaming." In sum, this paper reflects Kierkegaard's lasting antipathy toward the press, his skepticism of reforms that are purely political, and his concern about the violent or destructive aspects historically associated with some political reform movements, particularly the French Revolution. Though he would publish reviews in various papers himself, he maintained a lifelong mistrust of the press as a legitimate organ of communication. This skepticism arose from the observation that the press expressed the voice of the masses rather than that of the individual. Kierkegaard regarded that collective voice with doubt and sarcasm, later asserting that even if the crowd is technically correct, it is inherently mistaken simply by being a crowd. Truth, in his view, could only be stated and lived out by individuals, particularly as individuals before God. At this early stage, however, his understanding of the masses was not fully developed. This next article marked the first of three significant literary battles in which Kierkegaard would engage, the others being the Corsair affair and the attack upon Christendom. In this initial exchange, the sequence unfolded as follows: an anonymous multi-part article defending the liberal press, Kierkegaard's reply, a counter by Johannes Hage, Kierkegaard's subsequent response, a reply by Ole Lehmann, and finally Kierkegaard's rejoinder to Mr. Ole Lehmann. Lehmann and Hage were respected writers of their day, whereas Kierkegaard was still unknown. The early exchanges were anonymous, with authors only revealing their names in later responses. One of Kierkegaard's motives in this exchange was clearly to establish his presence as a writer. In his anonymous article, Lehmann defended the press against its occasional errors by arguing that everyone makes mistakes. Kierkegaard found this a weak point to attack, seizing on phrases in Lehmann's text that lent themselves to ridicule, such as "dawn of the life and freedom of the people." Kierkegaard criticized the paper for its acrimony and errors, arguing that it erred more frequently than one could reasonably tolerate. As Kierkegaard's thought matured, he increasingly saw man as a spiritual psychical being rather than a political entity, and thus resisted reforms that were solely political in nature. This perspective has led some to view him as a conservative, though for Kierkegaard, declining interest in theology seemed to correspond with increased attention to politics. He observed that, while the press appeared to be reforming, a closer examination revealed it to be more of a parody of genuine reform. In these interactions between Kierkegaard, Lehmann, and Johannes Hage, the disputes quickly expand beyond personal disagreements to critiques of rival newspapers and their political alignments. Lehmann and Hage champion the liberal press, while Kierkegaard, though not strictly a conservative, more an anti-revolutionary, broadens his critique to encompass the entire liberal movement. Throughout this exchange, familiar conservative criticisms appear. Conservatives dwell on the glories of the past, and liberals prioritize action over reflection. While Kierkegaard demonstrates his literary skill and shows little interest in conciliation, he is also deepening his antipathy toward the political reformers of the day. He continues to mock some of Lehmann's expressions, even when responding primarily to Hage. Kierkegaard addresses Hage's critique that he pursues polemic for its own sake rather than truth, and that he seeks to glorify his own little self, a judgment that is not entirely unfounded. It is strange to see that a party that on the whole shouts so much about intelligence has so little of it. It is strange to see a paper that speaks excitedly against ascribing bad motives to its opponents make itself guilty of the same fault. Kierkegaard expands his critique from the writings of his opponents to the liberal newspapers, the entire liberal movement, and the present age more broadly. Nothing very much is accomplished by these accusations, except that the present age's lack of intelligence allows it to pay heed to such invectives. To Mr. Ole Lehmann is Kierkegaard's fourth published article, and the third installment in this exchange. Lehmann re-enters the debate, attempting to moderate the conflict with a conciliatory tone and by publishing under his own name. Kierkegaard responds similarly under his own name, but dismisses any peacemaking gestures. He is less concerned with personal reconciliation than with highlighting a broader issue, the inability of political reform alone to address the deeper difficulties of life. Lehmann argues that liberalism must be restrained to avoid excesses similar to those of conservatives, but this is insufficient for Kierkegaard. On the surface, Kierkegaard frames his defense in personal terms, asserting his commitment to truth against charges that he merely attacks opponents for sport. Yet this early distaste for politics would evolve into a sustained critique of mere political reform. Kierkegaard remained philosophically and intellectually far removed from thinkers like Karl Marx. From the papers of one still living was a newspaper serial written while Kierkegaard was still a student. It contains a review of the novel Only a Fiddler by Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish writer of fairy tales, poet, novelist, and dramatist. Kierkegaard critiques Andersen for completely lacking any philosophy of life, and challenges his assertion that genius is an egg that needs warmth for the fertilization of good fortune, otherwise it becomes a wind egg. Even in this early work, Kierkegaard emphasizes the importance of the individual and rejects the romantic ideology that dominated 19th-century thought. He disputes the notion that environment alone determines genius, arguing instead that each person requires an idea for which they might live. A life view, Kierkegaard suggests, is more than a collection of positions held in abstract impersonality. It is more than mere experience, which is always atomistic. It represents the transubstantiation of experience, an unshakable sureness in oneself, forged from all that one has lived. When asked how such a view of life is acquired, Kierkegaard responds that for anyone who does not allow life to dissipate aimlessly but strives to turn its individual expression inward, a moment must inevitably arrive in which a strange illumination spreads across existence. This insight comes without the need to understand every detail at once, yet it provides the key for later comprehension. There must come a moment when, as Daub observes, life is understood backwards through the idea. The work's significance lies less in its critique of Andersen's novel than in its tentative presentation of Kierkegaard's theory of the individual, or more precisely, his passionate advocacy of a particular kind of individualism. This is advanced partly through a rejection of the explicit romantic sentimentality and implicit social determinism in Andersen's portrayal of the self-pitying genius, but also, less overtly, through a critique of the Hegelian ideas upon which Kierkegaard seems to draw in his discussion of Romanticism. Although Kierkegaard would later describe rereading Andersen's fairy tales as like taking a rejuvenating bath, he had no such sympathy for this novel about an aspiring violinist thwarted by circumstance. His main complaint is that Andersen projects himself into the work, and that this self hardly qualifies as a genuine personality. First and foremost, the poet must win for himself a competent personality, Kierkegaard writes, and this, so to speak, dead and transfigured personality it is that must and can produce, not the many-sided, worldly, palpable one. Here, the influence of Hegel's critique of Romanticism and the Romantic artist is apparent, a perspective Kierkegaard encountered in Heiberg's Hegelian lectures on aesthetics at the University of Copenhagen. Heiberg had suggested the idea of a book about Andersen, although he rejected Kierkegaard's finished manuscript, which Kierkegaard published himself. The notion of a dead and transfigured self as the source of creativity illuminates Kierkegaard's title and reflects his own conception of a competent personality achieved through a Lebensanschauung, or life view, more than a gathering up of a sum of propositions, and more than mere experience, the very transubstantiation of experience, and an unshakable confidence in oneself which has been won in the teeth of the merely empirical. Andersen's depiction of the self-pitying genius likely struck a chord with Kierkegaard, who at the time saw himself less as an artist and more as a melancholic, overly imaginative individual, captivated by possibility, yet trapped in what he would later call a life of glittering inactivity, isolation, and a sense of inherited sin. His father's gloomy pietism and the weight of ancestral guilt seemed as inevitable as Andersen's violinist's failure. Critics have connected Kierkegaard's judgment of Andersen with his own self-criticism in the Gilleleage Journal, where he laments lacking the idea for which I can live and die. In the point of view for my works as an author, he describes his spiritual state at the time as one of extraordinary possibility, the significance and the definition of which I did not myself understand. I had not lived, man I had not been. The period leading up to this work, however, marked a personal turning point. Kierkegaard reconciled with his father and, through this, with God, experienced a conversion that transformed his melancholy into indescribable joy, and recommitted to both his theological studies and an ethical, religious life. In this context, Andersen, a member of the literary boarding house circle with whom Kierkegaard had lived and whom contemporaries described as a sentimental, defenseless giant, must have appeared as a haunting reminder of the aesthetic life, the life of being only a fiddler, which Kierkegaard was now determined to surpass. Andersen was initially hurt by the critique, but the two later reconciled. Kierkegaard sent him a copy of the second edition of Either or, for which Andersen expressed gratitude. "You have given me really great pleasure by sending me your Either or. I was, as you can well understand, quite surprised. I had no idea at all that you entertained friendly thoughts of me, and yet I now find it to be so. God bless you for it. Thank you, thank you." Kierkegaard's only attempt at a play, The Battle Between the Old and the New Soap-Cellars, remains in sketch form. It depicts a young man facing an identity crisis, Willibald, possibly a reflection of Kierkegaard himself, who seeks intellectual guidance but is misled by flawed philosophy. The philosophical allusions primarily reference Hegelianism, though some contemporary references may escape the modern reader. The unofficial subtitle of the play is a heroic patriotic cosmopolitan philanthropic fatalistic drama, with an alternate title, The All-Embracing Debate on Everything Against Everything, or The Crazier the Better, from the papers of one still living against his will, dedicated to the 7 madmen of Europe, whom no city has wanted to acknowledge. The term all-embracing likely alludes to Hegelianism, which aimed to encompass all knowledge and methods of inquiry. The reference to the 7 madmen of Europe remains ambiguous, while the mention of from the papers of one still living echoes Kierkegaard's other works but does not precisely date this play. The play unfolds in 3 acts. Act 1 is set in Willibald's house, representing the world of actuality. Act 2 shifts to the world of ideality, the Prytaneum, described as a fantastic region. Act 3 continues in ideality and reaches a form of heavenly bliss, reflecting a Hegelian synthesis of actuality and ideality. In Act 1, the main figures are Willibald and his doppelganger, Echo. Willibald has just returned from a party where he was the center of attention. The play opens with his musings. Well, if I am going to be a shadow myself, I will at least compose a new one. I will create one, with great feeling, let there be a person. At that moment, the cloud from his pipe assumes the form of Echo. Willibald reacts. What do I see? Is it not my tormentor, my other self? The disappointment after the party recalls an entry from Kierkegaard's journal. He had been admired and laughed at as the life of the gathering, yet upon leaving he experienced despair. Willibald falls ill and becomes desperate to rid himself of Echo, who seeks medical help for him. When Echo returns, Willibald has vanished, attempting to escape the world of actuality altogether. On his flight, he encounters some conservative Christians, but he rejects their religion. Act 2 introduces Willibald in the realm of ideality, the Prytaneum, envisioned as a Greek foreign embassy of sorts. Here, philosophers present various interpretations of Hegelian thought to him, continuing his struggle to navigate the intellectual and existential challenges that define the play. Kierkegaard's early work, The Concept of Irony, was his dissertation and focused on the nature of irony, especially Socratic irony. The examiners considered it intelligent and noteworthy, but expressed concern over its style, which some found ambling, wordy, and idiosyncratic. Kierkegaard successfully petitioned the king to allow him to submit the dissertation in Danish rather than Latin, believing Danish better suited the material, though the defense colloquium itself was conducted in Latin. When it appeared, The Concept of Irony received few reviews. One anonymous critic praised it highly, but Mayor Aaron Goldschmidt criticized this for valuing style over content. Kierkegaard himself acknowledged that his style might challenge many readers, noting that in the first part of the dissertation, unusual approaches must be forgiven, just as he sometimes sang to lighten his work. This early work already shows Kierkegaard's idiosyncratic combination of content and style. His fascination with Socrates remained consistent throughout his career, particularly regarding the maxim, know thyself, and the theory of recollection. In later reflection, Kierkegaard expressed disappointment with his uncritical use of Hegel. He admitted that, influenced by Hegel and contemporary thought, he had incorrectly criticized Socrates for focusing on individuals rather than the whole, calling himself a Hegelian fool, while recognizing that this very point demonstrates Socrates' greatness as an ethicist. The concept of irony is divided into 2 parts. The first examines Socratic irony through the works of Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes, concluding with a discussion of Hegel. Kierkegaard agrees with most critics in finding Xenophon's Socrates unappealing and, more significantly, unworthy of execution. He observes that Xenophon's objective was to portray the Athenian condemnation of Socrates as a scandalous injustice. In doing so, Xenophon renders Socrates not only innocent but entirely harmless, so much so that it is remarkable the Athenians could have perceived in him anything beyond a good-natured, garrulous, and well-intentioned character, who neither does harm nor obstructs others, and whose casual nonsense is offered with fervent goodwill toward all who might listen. Kierkegaard next examines Plato's Socrates as he appears in the Symposium, the Protagoras, the Phaedo, the Apology, and the Republic. A key moment in the Apology involves Socrates' recounting of the oracle at Delphi, which declared him the wisest man. Socrates concluded that his wisdom lay in his awareness of his own ignorance, unlike others who falsely believed themselves wise. Kierkegaard notes that Hegel fails to recognize the irony here, taking the passage at face value, whereas he himself sees Socrates fully immersed in irony. Yet Kierkegaard believes Plato was not always conscious of Socrates' irony, and may have taken him seriously. Public resentment toward Socratic irony would help explain how the Athenians were able to condemn him to death. A careful reader of Plato will observe two forms of irony, one as a motivating force central to inquiry, and another that arrogates authority to itself. Since irony is present in the Apology, it cannot be dismissed simply because it differs from Platonic irony. Socrates' irony may have been distinct from Plato's. The challenge lies in understanding how Socrates could have mystified Plato so that Plato took his ironic remarks seriously. Kierkegaard acknowledges that, in general, Plato understood irony well, even in his later works, but it is difficult for any Plato to fully grasp Socrates. Moreover, one cannot expect Plato's writings to serve as a mere representation of Socrates, and no reader of Plato has ever sought a straightforward depiction of him. Kierkegaard surprises some by regarding Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates in The Clouds as enlightening and, in several ways, accurate. Though the play is often criticized for maligning Socrates, and is sometimes thought to have fueled the public sentiment leading to his execution, Kierkegaard sees merit in it. It is important first to accept that the Socrates on stage is indeed the historical figure. Ancient tradition supports this view, and many traits in the play align closely with what is otherwise known about Socrates. Kierkegaard highlights Socrates' unusual habits, such as standing still in meditation and his mysterious relationship with his personal daimon. These idiosyncrasies, combined with his irony, naturally lent themselves to Aristophanes' comedic portrayal. Additionally, some of Socrates' practices resembled those of the Sophists. Though he never charged for teaching, his dialectic sometimes demonstrated, as The Cloud suggests, how the weaker argument could be made stronger. Kierkegaard does not offer a precise definition of irony, but he clarifies its connection to dialectic. Everyone recognizes that irony and dialectic are the two dominant forces in Plato, yet there is also a duality within dialectic itself. One kind of irony serves merely as a stimulus for thought. It quickens thought when it grows sluggish and disciplines it when it becomes disordered. Another kind of irony is both the activator and the end goal, existing as a force in itself. Similarly, there is a dialectic that, in constant motion, ensures questions do not become trapped in superficial understanding, remaining vigilant and ready to lift issues back into consideration if they falter. This dialectic sustains the inquiry in suspension with the aim of resolving it. A second form of dialectic moves from abstract ideas toward more concrete manifestations, striving to construct actuality from the idea. Beyond these forces, Plato incorporates a third element, necessary to address the limitations of both, the mythical and the metaphorical. The first kind of dialectic corresponds to the first kind of irony, the second to the second, while the mythical aligns with the initial two and the metaphorical with the latter, though the mythical is not strictly tied to either, functioning more as a transitional or intermediary element, bridging gaps left by the partiality of the others. In the second part, Kierkegaard revisits Socratic irony. He describes irony as infinite absolute negativity, negative because it only negates, infinite because it does not target any particular phenomenon, and absolute because the source of its negation is a higher something that is still not. Irony establishes nothing, as that which is to be established lies beyond it. It qualifies subjectivity, granting the subject a negative freedom. The actuality that might give content is absent, leaving the subject free from external constraint, yet suspended because nothing holds him. This very suspension, however, imparts a form of enthusiasm, as the ironist becomes intoxicated with the infinity of possibilities. As a qualification of subjectivity, irony emerges historically when subjectivity first appears, and with this turning point, Socrates becomes central. For Socrates, The given actuality had lost all authority. He had become alien to the substantive world. This is one aspect of irony, but he also wielded it as a force against Greek culture. He was ignorant yet perpetually sought knowledge from others, letting existing structures continue only to see them falter. This method persisted until the end, most notably during his trial, but his fervent engagement ultimately consumed him, and irony overwhelmed him, leaving everything devoid of reality. Irony functions as negativity because it clarifies by negation, similar to the method used by some medieval theologians in negative theology, a method Kierkegaard himself, to some extent, echoes. Kierkegaard next examines his own categories in relation to Hegel, Fichte, Schlegel, Tieck, and Solger, situating them within the broader context of German philosophy and Romantic literature. Hegel is fundamentally hostile to irony. He took Socrates at his word when Socrates claimed ignorance, viewing irony as a flaw and therefore beneath the dignity of Socrates. In contrast, Kierkegaard critiques Fichte's emphasis on subjectivity, though he would later embrace subjectivism as a central concern. Schlegel, best known for his novel Lucinda, which Kierkegaard calls the Gospel of Young Germany, was widely regarded as immoral, yet he challenged the restrictive moral conventions of society, employing irony as an effective weapon. Kierkegaard acknowledges both the utility of irony and the book's perceived obscenity. Whereas Schlegel didacticizes, Tieck indulges in a more poetic and imaginative freedom. Tieck, though less determined to negate actuality than Schlegel, nonetheless demonstrates the way his excessive and ineffectual ideals drift like clouds in the sky, or shadows fleeting across the ground, revealing a departure from proper direction. Kierkegaard viewed Solger as failing to manifest the true negativizing quality of irony, instead succumbing to the positivizing tendencies of Hegel. Solger became a sacrifice to Hegel's positive system. Hegel's philosophy sought to subsume everything under a comprehensive system, naming and classifying all phenomena, leaving no space for irony. In this framework, irony could not be fully expressed, as the Hegelian schema allowed no room for its suspension or negation. Kierkegaard explores the significance of irony in relation to doubt. He observes that while contemporary discourse often emphasizes doubt as essential for science and scholarship, irony occupies a similar role in personal life. Just as science requires doubt, Kierkegaard suggests that a genuinely human existence requires irony. He concludes with reflections on subjectivity, anticipating themes he would later develop more fully in concluding Unscientific Postscript, which would come to dominate much of his thought. He argues that if the task of the present generation has any meaning, it is to translate the accomplishments of scientific scholarship into personal life, making them one's own. Kierkegaard also briefly considers the role of humor, which he would later examine in concluding Unscientific Postscript. Humor, he contends, represents a skepticism even deeper than irony, focusing on human sinfulness rather than mere finitude. The skepticism of humor relates to that of irony as ignorance relates to the old thesis credo quia absurdum. I believe because it is absurd, yet it carries a deeper positivity, moving in the anthropological rather than human categories, finding resolution not by elevating man but by uniting man with God. This Latin phrase, attributed to Tertullian, underpins Kierkegaard's later emphasis on the paradoxical as central to Christian faith, a theme he explores in Johannes Climacus and Practice in Christianity. Kierkegaard spent nearly all his life in Copenhagen, leaving only once to visit his father's birthplace and several times to travel to Berlin. He eagerly anticipated Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling's lectures there, rejoicing in Schelling's critique of the then-dominant Hegelian philosophy. Kierkegaard himself opposed Hegel throughout his work, and his later criticism of the Church partly sought to counter the entrenched Hegelian theology of figures like H. L. Martensen. He recalled the Berlin lectures with great enthusiasm, noting the moment Schelling connected philosophy to actuality as a revelation that filled him with joy. For Kierkegaard, the pure science of reason was negative and abstract, but it could approach completeness only by engaging with the positive, which allows reason to recognize its own limitations. Without the positive, the negative risks becoming obscured and mistaken for actuality. Later, Kierkegaard grew disappointed with Schelling's material, finding it of little value, yet the experience strengthened his anti-Hegelian stance. He remarked on Schelling's excessive discursiveness, yet acknowledged the personal insights he gained, including a renewed enjoyment of travel and a reaffirmation of his need for freedom. In Public Confession, although one of Kierkegaard's early works, the authorial distance that would later define his theory of authorship is already apparent. Some of his early pseudonymous articles had been attributed to him, and this work gave him the chance to deny responsibility for them. He maintains that just as it is irritating to be blamed for what one has not done, it is equally troubling to receive praise one does not deserve. He declares his position candidly, acknowledging his frailty and confessing that he has not written a single line, that he has no part in the work at all, not even the smallest. While pseudonymity and anonymity were fairly common in 19th-century literature, Kierkegaard's use of pseudonyms was highly distinctive. The articles he refers to were written during his student years, some under the pseudonym A and others under the pseudonym B, which he would later reuse in either/or. This makes Public Confession significant, as it shows how early Kierkegaard began to shape his authorial intentions. He asks that those interested in him never regard him as the author of anything that does not bear his name.